You'll see I've cunningly changed the title slightly of the presentation. Sorry. Although that content is still in there. So first of all, I should just say that I'm not really the right person to be giving this presentation. My colleague Sabine, who unfortunately couldn't be here, is the author of the vast majority of this work. She is an environmental psychologist who's been working on marine topics and the behaviour change techniques to generate less impact, or less generation actually, of marine litter. And Sabine, through her work at Plymouth University, has been leading the behaviour change component of a project called Mollisco, and there are some kind of important lessons, I think, from that project that are potentially useful for this project, so I'll do my best to convey those. Just by way of context, very briefly, Mollisco was a Framework 7 project. It ended in 2015, and it was focused on sort of societal responses to the marine litter problem. The goals of the project are noted down the left-hand side there: to raise awareness, to assess attitudes, perceptions and barriers, and then to evaluate the changes that were generated by specific interventions. And the role that Sabine and Plymouth University had in that was essentially to do the evaluation of those interventions. So hopefully you can see there are some similar steps in that project as there are in this project. So the entire cycle of Mollisco is presented there. So there is some kind of natural science components to this, which is looking at the sources and trends in relation to marine litter, looking at some best practices, good practices, effective practices perhaps. There's some national level exhibitions and workshops. There was a video contest for young people, which we'll come back to before the end of the presentation, national debates, and some educational tools that were produced. All focused on marine litter and changing behaviour around marine litter, and the role that Sabine had, as I said, was to conduct a Europe-wide survey on perceptions of public and different stakeholder groups on marine litter, which I'll share the results of in a moment, but perhaps more importantly to do an evaluation from a psychological and environmental psychology perspective of what worked and what didn't work in the interventions to generate behaviour change, and I'll share one example of that. But first, I think it's just important, particularly given some of the comments that we've had already today, just to think about why psychology is important to all of this. When we're talking about behaviour, really we're talking about people making decisions. And if you think about yourself, I mean, what are the factors that help you or control the decisions you make? And they're complicated. There's partly economic, partly social, partly, you want to be cool and do the thing everybody else is doing, partly you're influenced by your peers, all sorts of influences. So there's quite a lot of work on what prompts people to make decisions in the psychology sciences and behavioural sciences. And this is just one particular model. So we have decisions and behaviour in the middle there. Okay, so that's you, in effect, or an individual in effect. So what are their concerns? What habits do they have? What information sources do they trust that they're likely to act upon? What knowledge do they have, perhaps from their formal or informal education? How responsible do they feel for the issue that they're thinking about making a decision about? And how effective are their behaviours likely to be to generate a change? What are the social norms? What's expected of you as a member of society? And finally, what are the options open to you? An easy example there is if you do not have if your locality doesn't have, for example, a plastic recycling scheme, you don't have the option to recycle plastic. So it's something very simple there. So my colleague Sabine has done a lot of work in thinking about behaviour change and the drivers behind decision making in a marine microplastic context. So this is a paper that she's relatively recently published in 2016, and I've got a copy of it here to circulate. And I just highlighted a particular line there. Microplastics are a human-caused problem, and we need to understand the human dimension in order to address it. Can't get much clearer than that. And the paper outlines 9 issues to focus on in terms of the sort of psychology approach to this. And I've just highlighted 3. Human perception and behaviour can be subject to systematic and rigorous study using theory-based hypothesis testing, measurement and statistical analysis. Okay, this is not soft, this is hard. Experimental, quantitative approaches can compare randomized groups and study cause-effect relationships. So even for one-off case studies, we can identify their impact. And number 7, communications and interventions, for example, change campaigns, should be developed based on scientific insights into human thought and behaviour and then evaluated systematically. And that's the sort of work that Sabine and her colleagues do all the time. So just to share some of the results from the Molisco project, 2 big questions here. What are the perceptions that people have of the problem related to marine litter, and how can we change those perceptions and associated behaviours? Okay. So first of all, there was a Europe-wide survey focused on 11 different stakeholder groups. It was obviously, but it was conducted in different languages and generated some results. I'll just share some of those results. So the first thing to note, there were 3,748 responses to this survey. Quite big. The scale of this chart is 1 at the left-hand side is a strongly agree with the statement, strongly disagree with the statement, and number 5 is strongly agree, and number 3 is kind of meh in the middle. So marine litter is an important problem, high degree of agreement. Quantity of marine litter is increasing, yes, people agreed with that quite strongly. I'm very concerned about marine litter impacts, again, strong agreement. Marine litter is a future threat rather than a present threat. People disagree with that. There's recognition that marine litter is a problem now. The use we get out of modern materials outweighs any negative effects that they generate. People disagreed with that. So people recognise that the way we use plastics is a problem. So there is some inherent recognition from, if this survey is to be believed, that perhaps we need to rethink our behaviour. So it's not perhaps all as bad as we think. Second question, what about the impacts of marine litter? So the impacts on the marine environment. Number 1 is no threat, number 5 is a severe threat. So with respect to marine environment, people felt there was a severe threat. Aesthetically, a reasonably strong threat as well. Human health, yeah. Tourism at the coast, a threat. And shipping and fishing, less of a threat, but still just above neutral. Okay, so again, we're getting the sense here that people are recognising that marine litter is a problem. So maybe there is some concern in there. So in our earlier diagram, concern, social norms, all the rest of it, concern actually pretty high, it seems. And what about the perceptions of social norms in relation to marine litter? Well, so the scale here is strongly disagree 1, strongly agree 5. So most of my family and friends think it is important to reduce marine litter. Yes, on the whole, there's reasonably strong agreement with that. So it's getting kind of taking the temperature of the respondent's wider network of people. So the respondent seems to think there is some support for marine litter. Addressing marine litter, not support for marine litter, that'd be bad. Most of those close to me will support me in taking steps to marine litter, steps to reduce marine litter, I should say. Pretty strong agreement. And most people in my community don't care about marine litter. So there's kind of a sort of middle ground response to that. So this kind of talks to a little bit the comment I made earlier on, my intervention, around having some kind of evidence base for making assumptions about what people feel about the marine environment, their connectedness, their disconnectedness, and so on. It's a complex picture. It's not all one-way traffic. And this is a horribly complicated chart, but I'll just talk through it. So one of the subsets of the survey population were the general public. Okay, so this is just extracting that subset out and looking at the views that the public had on really who is responsible for dealing with marine litter, who has competence to deal with it, and who is motivated to deal with it. The scale at the side is 1 to 5, where 1 is strongly disagree and 5 is strongly agree. So the higher the bar, the more agreement there is that that particular body along the bottom has some responsibility, some competence, or some motivation. So I'll just talk through that in a little bit more detail. Okay, so checking out the red bars first, this is responsibility. So what it seems to be that the general public across Europe feel that governments and industry are those that are most likely or most expected to be responsible to deal with the threat of marine litter. Interestingly, self, this left-hand section of the chart there, there's also a very high response there. So people who responded to the survey also felt that they personally had some degree of responsibility to deal with marine litter issues. So again, maybe there is some inherent motivation for people to engage in this. We just need to tap into it in a way that works for them. Next, competence. So there's a perception of competence was pretty, actually, look at the blue bars, was pretty evenly distributed across all of the different organisations and sectors. But actually, the slightly higher bars really relate to the waste industry, so those that process waste and those that collect waste, educators, independent scientists, and environmental groups. And personal competence was slightly lower. Response. Oops, sorry. And finally, motivation. And this was the response that prompted most variation, I would say. The motivation was perceived to be very low amongst industry groups and government, whereas the motivation was perceived to be much higher amongst environmental groups, scientists and educators. So what does this tell us? Well, we kind of need to figure it out, don't we? I mean, if we're trying to do interventions to promote behaviour change, to support marine litter reduction, then maybe we need to build on those organisations that people think should be doing this sort of work, that people think are trusted and able to motivate, and are motivated to do this work. So maybe a government-sponsored campaign may not be the way forward. So again, it's kind of what we take from this is the important thing. So I said I would talk a little bit about an example of evaluation of a specific intervention. And one of the interventions that was established through the Molisco project was a Europe-wide video contest for children, I'm not sure the exact age range, but they're quite young, primary school age, I would say. So what would that be? That would be sort of 5 to 11, something like that. And Sabine and her team did a before and after evaluation of that age group in terms of the people who were involved in the video competition. So the people who were involved in the competition, what did they think before the competition and what did they think after? So what I'm going to do is just show you one of those videos. Before we go any further, I think I should translate the title. Right, Dunna, Chuck, Brook. Any thoughts? Yeah. So Dunna, don't, or do not. Chuck, throw. Brook. I had to look this up myself this morning. Brook is basically things that are aesthetically unpleasing. So garbage would be one of those things. Yeah. Right. Sorry. Carry on. It's a Scottish phrase.
This was upon a time that was a man, his name was Harry. Harry didn't care much for nature. There was just one thing he did like doing. That was going fishing. So off he went in his boat with a snack in a plastic bag. When Harry had finished, he threw his crisp packet in the sea. All of his rubbish went right into the Atlantic Ocean and got carried along by the Gulf Stream. The warm water that travels right across the ocean until it reaches Shetland. All the rubbish ended up here on our beach. Who's this? It's a waxwing and it is looking for food. Oh no, don't eat that. That's not food for you, it's plastic. If she eats that, she will feel full up and might die. We must help that waxwing.
Time for action. It's time for the boat ride up.
Hooray! The bird is safe and the beach is super clean.
Well done, everyone. This is good news for all the creatures who live in the sea too.
We can all make a difference, as we say in Shetland. Devour Red Up is the most successful community litter pick in the whole of Britain, and it happens here in Shetland every year. Many volunteers help to pick up rubbish found on Shetland's roadsides, coastlines and beaches. What are you waiting for?
Okay, so regardless of what you kind of think about the video itself, it's pretty cute, if nothing else, think about the process that those children went through. That is an intervention to support behaviour change, right? So what will they have had to have done to result in that video? What learning process will they have to have gone through? They need to understand what marine litter is, they need to understand the Gulf Stream, they need to understand the spatial connection between somebody dropping litter off a boat, which I presume must be out of Canada or the US. That wasn't clear from the video. They need to understand the spatial connectivity there. There's loads of stuff, I shan't go any further, but there's loads of stuff that they need to have understood in order to make that video. So the question has to be ultimately, what effect has that had on the behaviour of that group of people? So this is the work that Sabine has done. So the columns are, have the people, the children, separated litter for recycling? Have they used reusable items? Have they avoided using plastic bags? Have they encouraged others to reduce their dependence on plastic? Have they bought items with less packaging? Have they picked up litter? Have they thrown litter on the ground? So the before is the white bar and the green is the after bar. Okay, so this is self-reported behaviour amongst children. So, there is a certain error issue here, of course, but that error issue can be resolved through good social science, good design, good experimental design. It's not difficult if you know what you're doing. So this is pretty statistically robust outcome from this piece of work. We'll finish very soon. Okay, so the answer to the questions, are people concerned about marine litter? Yes. What are their perceptions of the impacts? Impact mixed. The role of social norm is mixed. Can we change perceptions and behaviour? Yes, we can. Final points from me. Sabine and her team have been working on sort of behaviour change in microplastics for a long time, or the last few years anyway. They've put together a booklet, this booklet here, that kind of summarises all their experiences and shares the good practice of that. So I've got that, feel free to come and borrow it at any stage. It's also online and the web link is there. GAZAMP, the group of experts on the scientific aspects of marine environmental protection, has also done a lot of work on microplastics now. So there is a good science base there, both natural and social, and Sabine and her team has written a section in this report focused specifically on behaviour change. Okay. Some acknowledgements, so there's the team at the Plymouth University, and finally, if you have any questions or want to follow any of that up, just contact me or Sabine, but mostly Sabine for that. Thank you.
Thank you. So, and now you pose a very difficult task to me, dear Steve. I have to explain everybody why this is in this part of the agenda on knowledge and not in the part of the agenda on behavior change tomorrow. Because we didn't communicate about it. Because I sent you the title of the presentation based on Sabine's publication, and you said yes. And now you told me short before you changed the title. Now, I will pose the question now back to you. What does it have to do with knowledge? There was something in your presentation at the very end when you said they have to understand a very complex issue about the ocean to do this video. So can you give me a little hands-on when we are thinking about still knowledge before going to behavior change? Where is the knowledge part in that? It's about facts, again?
So my view is there are two roles of knowledge. One is the role of knowledge in supporting the development of ocean literacy. That's a knowledge that we as educators, as professionals, bring to the development of ocean literacy. So that knowledge, which is what I was trying to illustrate, has to arise from a wide variety of sources, not just the pathway through which an activity prompts an impact. So the psychology, the social science, the behavioural science, the microeconomics of it, all this needs to be considered. So that's a huge knowledge that we need to apply to this problem, to this challenge. Then the second sort of role of knowledge is what is the knowledge that is needed when it's added together with the right motivation to generate some form of behaviour change. Mm-hmm. So knowledge is central to the whole thing, for sure, but knowledge in itself isn't the answer.
Okay. Yes, please, come in there. Can you pass the microphone?
I think that the very term, the marine litter, implies some knowledge, because that's what you see. It's not the. I think this term marine litter, it sounds that like some mermaids are polluting something, or nasty Americans, but it should be called the human waste simply. And it would be much easier to explain to others that you should not waste anything on the shores, and you should not leave your waste on the beach. So just take it back with you home. So why we call it marine litter? It makes me angry always.
That's an interesting question. We don't name, actually, we don't give the right headline to the things we want to communicate or the knowledge. Director, please pass the microphone to Igor. Why we call it
this is
marine litter?
exactly the experience which we have done, namely how to communicate. And our experience is the effect of any communication is much bigger when you communicate in a positive sense. So we have exactly tackled that question which you was just raising.
And what is your
our
answer?
position is, I've laid out some brochures. Our position is a positive message. So the material you want to get discarded is too valuable to be thrown away. So do it properly. So send a positive message. And then it's much more effective than you want. Otherwise, you may even frustrate the people. So always when communicating, think about which will be the resonance from the recipient of the actor. So that's the message about it.
But it doesn't satisfy Ingrid, because she says that why don't we tell that it's your waste? Why do we tell you could use it differently? Maybe then
But
there's not enough
positive
behind.
Message what to do with it, namely to properly handle it and to properly bring it to a collection site or whatever there is. But we leave it open in which way. And what we experience here as well, there was earlier the question, what does that mean, literacy? Because if you translate that to mentalities in the countries, there will be many, many different interpretations. So it's not only the one interpretation. I read Shakespeare in the literacy, so I'm now knowledgeable about it. So it's something completely different. So we need to understand in the different mentalities and transpose it then in the proper manner. That's the approach.
Okay, please pass the mic to the back behind you, Pierre.
Thanks. I was wondering whether when we say which knowledge, we should not differentiate between knowledge at which stage of a development of somebody that, if I go back to what Steve presented, is maybe not very motivated at the beginning, but still we feel might change behaviors and would be useful towards the change of behavior itself. If I would start, I would first start to say, that's Gloria, I try to understand her a bit. If I end up to say, but Gloria, she's not motivated, but still I have some knowledge to say that her change of behavior is central to change the problem, to address the problem. I'm not going to stop there. We need to find a way to communicate some type of knowledge to make her motivated or to find her motivation. So I have a first target, which is I try to bring you into the fact that you become motivated. Once Gloria starts to be a bit motivated, maybe I need to find a different type of knowledge to bring her to understanding better and maybe changing. So there is instead of, maybe we have to find a life of somebody. You know, I start, I don't know, I don't want, and then slowly I start to know, and a bit later I start to want, and then at some point I start to act. And the type of knowledge we give at each stage is maybe not the same. And it goes back also to maybe one question I had to Fiona at the beginning, which raised by Stephen, is, yes, we all have one holistic approach, but we'll all have different understanding of what we mean by holistic knowledge. So is the holistic approach, does it include what Stephen mentioned as knowledge to put on the table at some points of a cycle? When we talk about marine knowledge to describe the process and the problem itself, do we include knowledge about agriculture? Do we include knowledge about terrestrial activities that maybe are more fundamental in impacting marine ecosystem, etc., etc.? So I think that's maybe also something we have to put a bit of light to understand what we mean by holistic. And maybe one last thought I had, it came earlier. It's the complexity of a relationship between myself and the ocean. As a consumer, what I did since this morning has so many impacts on the sea that I'm not able to capture it anymore. You would need to give me some information about, I started to drink coffee. The coffee came from Thailand by marine sea, by some ship. You tell me coffee then is not very right, I start to drink a juice, but the juice also comes from fruit that comes from somewhere else. Okay, so I stop drinking my juice, I go back to water that is in plastic bottle. Then you ask me to sit here and to start presenting a presentation with my computer, is in plastic also, and at some point, because of the distance, but also the multiplicity of the connections between my behavior and the sea, I don't know anymore what I would need to know. So one question was, when it comes to consumers, is the message not really about marine literacy, but much more about limiting footprint in a very general sense, where the sea is one component and just being careful on what I do in my daily life. So that's a question I ask. We had the same discussion once at the beginning of the ocean literacy journey, because in the first event in Plymouth, we talked about ocean literacy, but we realized there was also climate change literacy, biodiversity literacy, and so a range of literacy. Then I was getting a bit lost into all what I need to know. So what is left for me as a consumer?
You can drink Riga balsam from a natural clay bottle, but unfortunately it's also meanwhile packed with a plastic top. So, but we will investigate that. Thank you, Pierre.